April 23, 1945. Somewhere along the Elbe River, central Germany. The air smelled of wet canvas and charred wood. Morning mist clung to the skeletal remains of a field hospital. White tarps flapping against iron poles, mud sucking at the boots of women in grey wool uniforms. The German nurses moved through the wreckage like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn, eyes fixed downward as they stepped over splintered crates marked with faded red crosses. They had been retreating for weeks now, following the collapsing Wehrmacht lines eastward, always eastward, until there was nowhere left to go. And then, on this cool spring morning, the Americans arrived. They came not with tanks or artillery, but with jeeps and supply trucks, with voices that rang out in accents the German women had only heard through propaganda broadcasts, sharp, confident, impossibly cheerful. Among them were women. American women. Nurses in olive drab fatigues, their hair pinned beneath garrison caps, their arms loaded with medical supplies and something else, something small and black that glinted in the weak sunlight. Cameras. Kodak Brownies and Argus C3S, compact machines that fit in the palm of a hand, instruments the German nurses had seen before only in the hands of official photographers or wealthy tourists in peacetime Berlin. One American lieutenant, a woman named Catherine Holloway from Des Moines, Iowa, approached a cluster of German nurses huddled near a collapsed surgical tent. She held out her camera, a simple folding Kodak, and smiled. The German women stared. Not at the camera itself, but at the ease with which this American woman held it, the casual ownership, as if such a device were as common as a hairbrush or wristwatch. To the German nurses, who had spent 6 years under rationing, under regulations, under the suffocating weight of total war, the sight was incomprehensible. Cameras were luxuries. Cameras were for the party, for official documentation, for carefully controlled memory. And here was this woman, this enemy, offering to teach them how to use one. The moment hung suspended, fragile as spring frost. Then one of the German nurses, a thin woman with hollow cheeks and trembling hands, reached out and touched the camera's leather case. Her fingers traced its stitching. She looked up at Lieutenant Holloway, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, something like curiosity flickered behind her exhaustion. To understand the shock that rippled through that field hospital on the Elbe, one must first understand what the camera represented in the two worlds now colliding. In Nazi Germany, photography had been weaponized. Under Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, the camera was a tool of the state, a means to construct reality, to sculpt heroic narratives from carefully staged images of marching soldiers, gleaming factories, and adoring crowds. Private photography was not forbidden outright, but it was constrained, controlled. Film was rationed. Cameras were expensive. By 1943, with the war turning against Germany, most civilians had neither the means nor the permission to document their own lives. The official narrative was all that mattered. For German nurses, women who served in the Sanitätsdienst or the Deutsches Rotkreuz, the camera was even more distant. They worked in a realm of secrecy and censorship. Photographing casualties was prohibited. Documenting suffering contradicted the propaganda of invincibility. They moved through field hospitals and evacuation centers as witnesses to carnage, but their testimony was to be kept silent, locked behind duty and discipline. Their world was one of observation without record, of memory without proof. In America, the camera told a different story entirely. By 1945, photography had become democratized to an extent unimaginable in wartime Europe. Eastman Kodak had been mass-producing affordable cameras since the 1900s, and by the 1940s, millions of American households owned at least one. The Brownie camera, introduced in 1900 for just $1, had transformed photography from an elite pursuit into a middle-class pastime. Soldiers carried cameras overseas. Families documented birthdays and vacations. Photography was not an instrument of state control but an expression of individual life, personal memory, domestic joy. When American nurses arrived in Europe with cameras in their pockets, they carried more than devices for capturing light on film. They carried an ideology, one that said ordinary people had the right to document their own existence, to create their own narratives, to own their own memories. To the German nurses, this was revolutionary. Not in the political sense of revolution, but in the deeper sense of worldview. It challenged everything their government had taught them about who controlled truth, who owned history, who had permission to remember. The German nurses had expected defeat. By April 1945, that was no longer a question. They had watched the maps shrink, the supply lines collapse, the radio broadcasts grow more desperate and shrill. They had nursed boys, barely men, with limbs torn away by Russian artillery, with lungs full of shrapnel, with eyes that stared at nothing. They had heard the rumors of what was happening in the East, the stories whispered between shifts about refugees and atrocities, about cities reduced to ash. They knew the war was lost. What they had not expected was this: kindness, abundance, and strangest of all, equality. The American nurses who arrived at the field hospitals that spring were professional, efficient, brisk in manner but not cruel. They distributed supplies, real morphine, clean bandages, penicillin in quantities the Germans had not seen in years. They set up field kitchens that produced food in bewildering variety: canned meat, powdered eggs, coffee, chocolate bars, white bread soft as cotton. The German nurses, many of whom had been subsisting on black bread and watery soup, stood in line beside American GIs and received the same portions. No one asked for papers. No one demanded proof of loyalty. The food simply appeared, was heated, was served. And then there were the cameras. Lieutenant Holloway was not alone. Across the occupation zones, American nurses carried personal cameras, and they used them constantly. They photographed each other in front of ruined buildings. They posed with German children. They snapped pictures of wildflowers growing through bomb craters, of makeshift Christmas trees, of their own muddy boots propped on ammunition crates. They documented not the grand sweep of history but its small, human moments. And when German nurses watched, bewildered, the Americans noticed. "Here," Lieutenant Holloway said that morning by the Elbe, holding out her Kodak. "Look through here. Press this button. That's all." The German nurse hesitated. Her name was Margaret Schiller, though the Americans would not learn this until later. She had been a nurse since 1939, had served in Poland, in France, in Russia. She had forgotten what it felt like to choose anything for herself: what to eat, where to sleep, what to remember. And now this American woman was handing her a machine that captured light, that froze time, that made permanent what the eye saw. It felt dangerous. It felt like power. Margaret took the camera. Her hands, skilled at sutures and injections, fumbled with the viewfinder. She aimed it at nothing in particular: a patch of muddy ground, a tent pole, the sky. Then she turned it toward her colleague, Nurse Hilda Brenner, who sat on a crate with her head in her hands. Through the viewfinder, Margaret saw her friend transformed, not a defeated enemy, not a cog in a failed machine, but a woman. Tired. Human. Real. She pressed the shutter. The click was almost inaudible, lost in the wind and the distant rumble of trucks. But to Margaret, it sounded like a door opening. The historical record of this moment is fragmented, scattered across dozens of memoirs, military reports, and personal letters archived in places like the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center and the Bundesarchiv in Germany. But the pattern is consistent. In the spring and summer of 1945, as American forces occupied Western Germany and established control over former Nazi territories, small acts of cultural exchange occurred in the margins of official policy. American nurses, WACs, and Red Cross volunteers, many of them young women from middle-class backgrounds, interacted with German nurses and civilian women in ways that defied simple narratives of victor and vanquished. One report from the 45th General Hospital, stationed near Nuremberg in May 1945, notes, American staff have been observed sharing personal items with German medical personnel, including cosmetics, cigarettes, and photographic equipment. While fraternization policies officially prohibit such exchanges, the practice is widespread and appears to boost morale on both sides. Another account, from the diary of Captain Eleanor Ross, an Army nurse from Pennsylvania, describes teaching a group of German Red Cross nurses how to use her Argus C3 camera. They were fascinated by it. One asked if it was very expensive. I told her it cost about $25 back home. She didn't believe me. She said in Germany before the war, a camera like this would cost a month's wages. I showed her how to load the film, how to focus, how to adjust for light. She took a picture of the hospital garden. We'd planted tomatoes and lettuce. When I told her she could keep the photograph once I had it developed, she cried. These were not grand gestures of diplomacy. They were not sanctioned by policy or designed to advance strategic goals. They were simply human moments, the kind that occur when individuals meet across the wreckage of ideology and recognize each other as something other than symbols. But their impact rippled outward in ways the participants could not have predicted. To the German nurses, the camera became a symbol of something they had lost and not yet named: agency. The ability to choose what to remember. The power to say, this matters to me, and I will keep it. Under the Nazi regime, memory had been collectivized. The individual was subsumed into the vogue, personal experience into national mythology. Photography reflected this hierarchy. Official images showed strength, unity, destiny. Private images, when they existed at all, were modest, circumspect, always aware of the watching state. The camera was a tool for constructing the Reich's version of reality, not for capturing personal truth. The American approach was radically different, though the Americans themselves rarely articulated it. For them, photography was casual, democratic, ubiquitous. It was how you remembered your mother's birthday, your friend's wedding, your dog in the backyard. It was unexceptional. But to women who had lived for 6 years under a regime that controlled every aspect of public and private life, this casualness was shocking. It suggested a society where ordinary people were trusted with the tools of documentation, where personal memory was not a threat to collective order, where you didn't need permission to say, "I was here. This happened. It mattered." Nurse Margaret Schiller, who took that first hesitant photograph by the Elbe, wrote in a letter to her sister in July 1945, "The Americans have so much. Not just food and medicine, though they have plenty of that. They have freedom in ways I am only beginning to understand. They carry cameras the way we carry handkerchiefs. When I asked Lieutenant Holloway why she takes so many pictures, she laughed and said, 'So I don't forget.' As if forgetting were a choice. As if memory belonged to her alone." This realization, that memory could be personal, that documentation could be intimate, that the camera could serve the individual rather than the state, began to shift something in the German nurses who encountered it. It did not erase their past. It did not absolve them of complicity in a regime that had committed atrocities. But it opened a space for a different kind of future, one in which they might reclaim their own stories from the ruins of the official narrative. The process of teaching was itself significant. Lieutenant Holloway and her colleagues did not simply hand over cameras and walk away. They took time, hours, sometimes days, to explain the mechanics, how light entered through the lens, how the shutter controlled exposure, how film captured and held an image. They discussed composition, framing, focus. They treated photography as a skill worth teaching, and by extension, treated the German nurses as students worth teaching. This was not universal. American policy toward defeated Germans was inconsistent, oscillating between punitive measures and pragmatic cooperation. Fraternization bans were enforced, then ignored, then enforced again. Some American personnel viewed all Germans with suspicion or contempt. Others, particularly women who worked in medical or humanitarian capacities, seemed more willing to recognize shared humanity. But for those who participated in these small exchanges, the act of teaching photography became something more than technical instruction. It became an exchange of values. When an American nurse showed a German nurse how to adjust the aperture for a brighter image, she was also demonstrating a worldview in which individual perspective mattered, in which the photographer's eye, not the state's directive, determined what was worth capturing. When a German nurse took her first photograph and saw it develop days later, she held in her hands proof that her vision, her choice, her memory, had been made real. One particularly detailed account comes from Nurse Hilde Brenner, Margaret Schiller's colleague, who kept a journal throughout 1945. In an entry dated June 12, she writes, "Today Lieutenant Holloway brought me the photographs I took last week. There are 5 of them. One shows the apple tree behind the barracks, in bloom. I had forgotten it was blooming. I had stopped seeing such things. But the camera saw it. Now I have it, this small square of paper that says, even here, in this terrible place, something beautiful existed. I chose to remember it. That choice feels like waking up." The symbolic weight of the camera grew heavier as the occupation continued and the full scope of Nazi crimes became undeniable. In the summer of 1945, as concentration camps were liberated and evidence of the Holocaust was documented, photography took on a darker significance. Allied forces used cameras to record the atrocities, piles of bodies, emaciated survivors, gas chambers, and crematoria. These images were necessary, brutal proof of what had been done. They served justice, history, memory. But for German nurses who had taken up cameras in those first months of occupation, the device now carried a dual meaning. On one hand, it represented the freedom to document personal truth, to reclaim individual memory. On the other, it confronted them with the question of what had been done in their name, what they had chosen not to see, not to remember. Some, like Margaret Schiller, used their cameras to document the rebuilding. She photographed children playing in rubble, women clearing debris, gardens planted in bomb craters. Her images were small acts of defiance against despair, assertions that life might continue, that beauty might return. Others, like Hilde Brenner, photographed the ruins themselves, collapsed buildings, empty streets, memorials hastily erected for the dead. These were images of accountability, of refusal to look away. In both cases, the camera became a tool for grappling with the past. Not in the propagandistic sense of constructing a flattering narrative, but in the personal sense of bearing witness. The German nurses who learned photography from their American counterparts were learning a new grammar of memory, one that made space for complexity, for ambiguity, for the difficult work of honest recollection. Lieutenant Catherine Holloway returned to Iowa in December 1945. She brought with her hundreds of photographs, images of ruined cities and blooming fields, of fellow nurses and German civilians, of jeeps and hospitals and children. She kept them in a showbox in her closet and rarely spoke about the war. In a letter to a friend written in 1947, She mentions teaching German nurses to use cameras. I don't know if it mattered. Maybe it was a small thing, a distraction. But I remember their faces when they looked through the viewfinder for the first time. It was like they'd forgotten they had the right to look at the world and choose what to keep. Margaret Schiller survived the war and the occupation. She worked as a nurse in West Germany through the 1950s and 60s, eventually retiring in 1972. Among her possessions, found after her death in 1989, was a battered Kodak Brownie camera and several albums of photographs. The images span decades: post-war reconstruction, family gatherings, vacations to the Alps, grandchildren. The earliest photographs, dated 1945, show a field hospital by a river, a blooming apple tree, a woman sitting on a crate with her head in her hands. On the back of one, in faded ink, is written, "My first photograph. A gift." Hilda Brenner became a photographer. She studied at an art school in Munich in the late 1940s, supported herself by taking portraits and documenting post-war recovery efforts. In the 1960s, she published a book of photographs titled Trümmer und Licht, Rubble and Light, that combined her early images of post-war Germany with reflections on memory, guilt, and reconstruction. In the introduction, she writes, "I learned to use a camera from an American nurse whose name I never forgot. She taught me more than mechanics. She taught me that I had the right to remember, and the responsibility to remember honestly. That tension, between right and responsibility, has defined my life's work." The story of German nurses learning photography from American women in 1945 is not a story of redemption. It does not erase the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, nor does it absolve those who served it. It is not a tale of enemies becoming friends, of wounds magically healed by small kindnesses. War does not work that way. History does not offer such tidy resolutions. But it is a story about the power of ordinary objects to carry extraordinary meaning. The camera, that small black box of glass and metal, became a vessel for ideas that transcended its physical form. In the hands of American nurses, it represented a society where individuals were trusted with the tools of documentation, where personal memory was not a threat to collective order, where democracy meant, among other things, the right to remember. In the hands of German nurses, it became a tool for rebuilding selfhood, for reclaiming agency, for learning to see the world and themselves anew. The camera taught them that memory could be chosen, not imposed. That perspective mattered. That even in the wreckage of total defeat, the act of looking through a lens and saying, "This is what I see, and I choose to keep it," was an assertion of humanity. 75 years later, the photographs remain. They are stored in archives and family albums, in university collections and museum exhibitions. Black and white images of ruined cities and blooming trees, of women in uniform and children in rubble, of moments that someone, some individual human being with a camera in hand, decided were worth remembering. They are small things, these photographs. Fragments of light on paper. But they carry within them the echo of a larger transformation, a slow and difficult shift from a world where memory was controlled by the state to one where it might belong, at least in part, to the people who lived it. In one photograph, taken on a spring morning by the Elbe River in 1945, a German nurse holds a camera for the first time. Her face is partially obscured, turned away from the lens as she looks through the viewfinder. But her posture is unmistakable, tentative, curious, hopeful. She is learning to see. She is learning to choose. She is learning, in the quiet click of a shutter, what freedom might mean. And in that small, almost invisible moment, something shifts. Not the grand machinery of history, not the sweep of politics or the thunder of armies, but something quieter and more enduring. The recognition that every person holds the right to witness their own life, to document their own truth, to say, "I was here. I saw this. It mattered." That recognition, born in the rubble of 1945 and carried forward in 1,000 small photographs, is democracy's most intimate promise. Not that all will be well, or that justice will always prevail, but that each of us, each individual, irreplaceable soul, has the right to look at the world through our own lens and choose what we will keep. That choice, fragile and hard one, is the light we carry through the ruins toward whatever comes next. It is the gift the American nurses gave without fully understanding its weight. And it is the gift the German nurses received, held carefully, and passed on, one photograph, one memory, one honest moment at a time. The camera, in the end, was never just about images. It was about who had the power to create them, to keep them, to say, "This happened, and I will not forget." In a world emerging from the darkness of totalitarianism, that power, simple, democratic, profound, was a kind of light. And light, even the small light captured by a lens, has always been enough to begin again.